In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Florence's most cunning minds once plotted the fate of republics and kingdoms, there echoes still the wisdom of Niccolo Machiavelli, a man who understood power not as poets dream of it, but as it truly operates in the merciless theatre of human ambition. His observations, carved from the marble of hard experience and polished by centuries of political upheaval, reveal truths that leaders in every age have learned too late. That certain behaviors, seemingly minor in isolation, accumulate like poison in the bloodstream of authority until they bring down even the mightiest. The Renaissance master who gave us the Prince understood that leadership is not merely about commanding others but first and foremost about commanding oneself. In his secret correspondence and private observations, Machiavelli identified 9 patterns of public behavior that consistently destroy those who practice them. Behaviors so insidious that their practitioners rarely recognize their own hand in their downfall. Yet within this dark catalogue of human folly lies a deeper truth, one that speaks to the possibility of transformation. The leader who can identify and eliminate these weaknesses within himself becomes, in Machiavelli's words, a fortress that cannot be taken by siege or storm. This is not merely an academic exercise in historical analysis, but a living document of power's most dangerous pitfalls and the path beyond them. For an understanding how leaders fall, we discover how they might rise to heights that no external force can threaten. The 9 behaviors that herald a leader's doom. The fatal attraction of inconsistency among the most treacherous behaviors a leader can exhibit is the inability to maintain consistent positions, values, or decisions over time. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly in the Italian city-states, where rulers who changed their stances with each shifting political wind found themselves trusted by none and supported by fewer still. The inconsistent leader believes he demonstrates flexibility and responsiveness to changing circumstances, but what he actually broadcasts to the world is that his word carries no weight beyond the moment it is spoken. Consider the dynamics at play when a leader reverses course repeatedly. Each reversal erodes not just the specific policy or decision in question, but the entire foundation of trust upon which leadership rests. Followers begin to hedge their bets, withholding full commitment because they cannot predict what position their leader will take tomorrow. Allies become cautious about associating too closely with someone whose reliability cannot be assured. Enemies, meanwhile, recognize that they need only wait for the inevitable shift that will give them advantage. The psychological mechanism behind this destructive pattern often stems from a leader's desire to be liked by all parties, or from an overestimation of his ability to navigate complex situations by constantly adjusting his position. What such leaders fail to recognize is that in politics, business, and life itself, there are moments when one must plant a flag and defend it, regardless of the immediate cost. The temporary discomfort of maintaining a difficult position pales beside the permanent damage of being seen as unreliable. Machiavelli witnessed this phenomenon most clearly in the conduct of certain Italian princes who attempted to play all sides in the conflict between France and Spain. By promising support to both powers while delivering fully to neither, these rulers believed they were maximizing their options. Instead, they found themselves crushed between the very forces they had sought to manipulate, trusted by none and valued by fewer still. The consistent leader, by contrast, becomes a known quantity around which others can plan and build. Even those who disagree with his positions can respect the clarity of his stance and the reliability of his word. This creates a kind of gravitational field of trust that draws supporters and gives pause to opponents who know they face someone whose reactions they can predict and whose commitments they can count on. The seduction of excessive emotional display. The second behavior that Machiavelli identified as fatal to leadership is the tendency toward uncontrolled emotional expression in public settings. While the modern era often celebrates authenticity and emotional intelligence, the Florentine philosopher understood that leadership requires a careful calibration of emotional display. Too little appears cold and inhuman, but too much destroys the mystique of competence and control that followers need to see in their leaders. The leader who weeps publicly at every setback, who rages visibly at every opposition, who celebrates with abandon at every victory, creates a pattern of instability that followers find deeply unsettling. Not because emotions themselves are wrong, but because the leader's role includes serving as an anchor of stability for others during turbulent times. When the leader himself becomes a source of emotional turbulence, the entire organization or nation suffers from a lack of steady guidance. This principle extends beyond mere emotional outbursts to encompass the broader question of composure under pressure. Machiavelli noted that successful leaders develop what might be called public discipline. The ability to maintain a calm and measured demeanor even when facing extraordinary stress or provocation. This is not the same as being emotionless or unfeeling, but rather about understanding that leadership is, in part, a performance that serves the psychological needs of those being led. The leader who masters this discipline gains several advantages. First, his composure becomes a source of confidence for others, who take their emotional cues from his behavior. Second, his controlled responses are more likely to be rational and effective, since emotion and sound judgment rarely occupy the same mental space simultaneously. Third, his unpredictability to opponents becomes a strategic asset, since they cannot easily provoke him into disadvantageous reactions. The destruction that follows from excessive emotional display is not always immediate or obvious. Often, it accumulates gradually as followers lose confidence in their leader's judgment and stability. They begin to work around him rather than with him, creating parallel structures of decision-making that eventually supplant his authority entirely. By the time the emotional leader recognizes what has happened, his formal position may remain intact while his actual power has evaporated. The poison of public weakness. Third among the fatal behaviors is the display of weakness or uncertainty in public forums where strength and conviction are expected. Machiavelli understood that leadership exists as much in perception as in reality, and that the leader who consistently appears weak, indecisive, or uncertain will find these perceptions becoming self-fulfilling prophecies as others lose confidence in his capabilities. This does not mean that leaders should never acknowledge mistakes or uncertainty. Indeed, strategic admissions of limited knowledge can enhance credibility. Rather, it concerns the overall pattern of public presentation and the crucial distinction between acknowledging specific limitations while maintaining general confidence and competence. The weak leader hedges every statement, apologizes for every decision, and seeks permission when he should be granting it. The mechanism of destruction here operates through the erosion of what Machiavelli called the mystery of power. Leadership requires a certain level of mystique, not deception, but rather the sense that the leader possesses capabilities and knowledge that justify his position of authority. When this mystique is repeatedly punctured by displays of weakness, uncertainty, or incompetence, the leader finds himself managing through formal authority alone, without the voluntary compliance that makes leadership effective. Perhaps more dangerously, the weak leader attracts challenges from subordinates and rivals who sense vulnerability. In the natural order of human hierarchies, weakness invites aggression just as surely as strength deters it. The leader who appears uncertain about his own authority will find others questioning it as well, leading to a cascade of challenges that can quickly overwhelm his ability to maintain control. The transformation from weakness to strength requires not just internal development, but also careful attention to public presentation. The leader must learn to project confidence even when feeling uncertain, to speak with authority even when grappling with doubt, and to maintain composure even when facing serious challenges. This is not hypocrisy, but rather the recognition that leadership involves serving others' need for security and direction. The trap of isolation. The fourth destructive behavior involves the leader's gradual disconnection from the reality experienced by those he leads. This isolation can be physical, intellectual, or emotional, but its effect is always the same. The leader begins making decisions based on incomplete or distorted information, losing touch with the conditions and concerns that actually drive his organization or nation. Machiavelli observed this pattern in numerous rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers and yes-men, creating echo chambers that reinforce their preconceptions while filtering out uncomfortable truths. Such leaders often remained unaware of growing problems until these issues reached crisis proportions, by which time effective solutions had become impossible or prohibitively costly. The isolation trap is particularly insidious because it often begins with legitimate security concerns or efficiency considerations. The leader restricts access to save time, limit distractions, or protect sensitive information. Gradually, however, these restrictions expand until the leader finds himself cut off from the very people and information streams he needs to lead effectively. This behavior destroys leadership through multiple mechanisms. First, it leads to poor decision-making based on incomplete information. Second, it creates resentment among followers who feel ignored or dismissed by their leader. Third, it allows problems to fester unaddressed until they become major crises. Fourth, it makes the leader appear arrogant and out of touch, eroding his credibility and support. The isolated leader also becomes vulnerable to manipulation by the small circle of advisors who retain access to him. These individuals can shape his perception of reality to serve their own interests, leading him to make decisions that benefit them rather than the broader organization or constituency he serves. Breaking out of isolation requires deliberate effort and systematic changes to the leader's information gathering processes. This might involve regular direct contact with frontline workers, customers, or citizens, the establishment of formal feedback mechanisms that bypass the normal chain of command, or the cultivation of informal networks that provide unfiltered information about conditions and concerns. The curse of micromanagement. Fifth, among the fatal behaviors is the compulsive need to control every detail of operations, making every decision personally rather than developing the capacity of subordinates to act independently within defined parameters. This micromanagement destroys leadership effectiveness by creating bottlenecks, stunting organizational growth, and breeding resentment among capable subordinates who find their abilities underutilized and their judgment questioned. Machiavelli recognized that effective leadership requires the ability to work through others, multiplying one's effectiveness by developing the capabilities of subordinates rather than trying to do everything oneself. The micromanaging leader, however, operates from a fundamental mistrust of others' abilities or motivations, leading him to insert himself into decisions and processes that would be better handled at lower levels. The destructive cycle begins when the leader's constant interference prevents subordinates from developing their own decision-making skills and confidence. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where subordinates indeed become less capable of independent action, seemingly validating the leader's initial distrust. Meanwhile, the leader becomes increasingly overwhelmed by the volume of decisions he has insisted on making personally, leading to delayed responses and poor quality choices due to information overload. The psychological roots of micromanagement often lie in the leader's fear of losing control or being held responsible for others' mistakes. Paradoxically, however, the micromanaging leader actually loses control more completely than his trusting counterpart, since his limited personal capacity cannot match the collective capability of a well-developed team operating with clear guidelines and appropriate autonomy. Organizations led by micromanagers typically suffer from several characteristic problems: slow decision-making, high turnover among capable employees, low morale, and limited scalability. The micromanager becomes a single point of failure for the entire organization, and his personal limitations become organizational constraints. The path beyond micromanagement requires developing systems and people rather than trying to control processes directly. This means establishing clear expectations and boundaries within which subordinates can operate independently, creating feedback mechanisms that provide information about results rather than requiring approval for every action, and gradually expanding the scope of decisions that others can make without direct supervision. The disease of favoritism. The sixth fatal behavior involves the consistent display of favoritism towards certain individuals or groups, creating a perception of unfairness that poisons relationships and undermines the leader's moral authority. Machiavelli understood that while leaders must work with different people in different ways, the appearance of systematic bias destroys the trust and cooperation necessary for effective leadership. Favoritism operates as a destructive force through several mechanisms. First, it creates resentment among those who perceive themselves as unfairly disadvantaged, leading them to withhold their full effort and cooperation. Second, it encourages sycophantic behavior among those seeking to become favorites, corrupting the flow of honest communication and advice. Third, it raises questions about the leader's judgment and fairness, undermining his credibility even among neutral observers. The favoritist leader often justifies his behavior by pointing to the superior performance or loyalty of his preferred individuals. However, this reasoning ignores the broader systemic effects of perceived unfairness and the way that favoritism can actually reduce overall organizational performance, even while benefiting particular individuals. Perhaps most dangerously, favoritism creates factions within the organization or nation, as people align themselves either with or against the leader's preferred group. These factions then compete for the leader's attention and resources, diverting energy from productive work toward political maneuvering and conflict. The appearance of fairness is often as important as actual fairness in maintaining leadership effectiveness. This means that leaders must not only make fair decisions but also ensure that their decision-making processes are transparent and understandable to those affected. When preferential treatment is necessary or justified, the reasons must be clearly communicated and connected to legitimate organizational or national interests rather than personal preference. The vanity of seeking universal approval. Seventh among the destructive behaviors is the compulsive need to be liked by everyone, leading to weak compromises, contradictory messages, and the inability to make necessary but unpopular decisions. Machiavelli observed that leadership often requires choosing between competing interests, and that the leader who tries to satisfy everyone typically satisfies no one while appearing weak and indecisive to all. The approval-seeking leader operates from a fundamental misunderstanding of the leadership role. Rather than seeing leadership as the responsibility to make difficult decisions for the good of the whole, he views it as a popularity contest where success is measured by the absence of criticism or conflict. This perspective leads him to avoid necessary confrontations, postpone difficult decisions, and craft policies that split the difference between competing positions rather than choosing the most effective course. The destructive effects of this behavior compound over time as problems that should have been addressed earlier are allowed to fester, and as the leader's indecisiveness becomes apparent to followers and opponents alike. Those who might have been satisfied with a clear decision, even one that disadvantaged them, become frustrated with the lack of direction and resolution. Moreover, the approval-seeking leader becomes vulnerable to manipulation by those who recognize his psychological need for acceptance. Interest groups, subordinates, and rivals can all use his desire to be liked as a lever to influence his decisions, leading him to make choices that serve their interests rather than the broader good he is supposed to represent. The paradox of leadership is that those who are too concerned with being liked often end up being neither liked nor respected, while those who are willing to accept necessary unpopularity in service of their responsibilities often earn grudging respect even from those who disagree with their decisions. The arrogance of dismissing opposition. The eighth fatal behavior involves the systematic dismissal or contempt for opposition voices, criticism, and dissenting opinions. While confidence and conviction are essential leadership qualities, the leader who cannot tolerate disagreement or learn from criticism cuts himself off from valuable information and creates enemies where he might have had constructive opponents or even eventual allies. Machiavelli understood that opposition is a natural and often healthy part of political and organizational life. The leader who treats all criticism as disloyalty or all opposition as enmity creates an environment where honest feedback disappears. Problems go unreported, and alternative perspectives are never considered. This leads to worse decision-making and greater organizational fragility. The contemptuous leader also tends to underestimate his opponents, assuming that disagreement with his position reflects stupidity, malice, or ignorance rather than legitimate differences in values, priorities, or analysis. This underestimation can lead to strategic mistakes and missed opportunities for compromise or collaboration. Furthermore, the dismissive treatment of opposition creates unnecessary enemies and hardens positions that might otherwise be flexible. People who might have been willing to work with the leader despite disagreements become implacably opposed when they feel their views have been dismissed without consideration. The wise leader learns to distinguish between the message and the messenger, extracting valuable insights even from hostile sources while maintaining his own convictions and authority. This requires the intellectual humility to recognize that criticism might contain valid points even when it comes from opponents, and the emotional discipline to respond to substance rather than tone or motivation. The final destruction betraying core principles, the ninth and perhaps most devastating behavior, is the abandonment of the fundamental principles and values that initially brought the leader to power or position. This betrayal destroys not only external support but also the leader's internal sense of purpose and direction, leaving him vulnerable to both external attack and internal collapse. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders typically rise to power by embodying certain principles or promising to achieve specific goals. When they abandon these foundational commitments for short-term advantage or convenience, they lose the very qualities that made them effective leaders in the first place. The principled leader has a kind of internal compass that guides decisions and provides consistency over time. The leader who abandons his principles becomes purely reactive, driven by immediate pressures rather than long-term vision. The destruction that follows from this betrayal operates on multiple levels. Supporters who believed in the leader's original principles feel betrayed and withdraw their backing. The leader's decision-making becomes erratic as he lacks the consistent framework that principles provide. His public statements become less credible, as observers note the gap between his professed values and his actions. Perhaps most importantly, the leader himself loses the sense of mission and purpose that sustained him through earlier challenges. Leadership is extraordinarily demanding, requiring sacrifices and enduring criticism that can only be justified by a deep commitment to something larger than personal advancement. When that commitment disappears, the leader finds himself unable to summon the energy and resilience that leadership demands. The path to destruction through principle betrayal is often gradual, beginning with small compromises that seem justified by immediate circumstances. Each compromise makes the next one easier, until the leader finds himself far from his original positions without quite understanding how he arrived there. By the time the transformation is complete, both his supporters and his sense of self have been lost. The fortress of self. Mastery as the foundation of unshakable power. Having catalogued the behaviors that consistently destroy leaders, we must turn to the deeper question that Machiavelli posed. How does one become truly undefeatable? His answer, refined through observation of both successful and failed rulers, centered on a paradox that continues to challenge leaders today, that external strength flows from internal mastery, and that the leader who conquers himself becomes unconquerable by others. This principle operates on several interconnected levels, each reinforcing the others to create what Machiavelli called a fortress of the soul. Unlike physical fortifications, which can be besieged and eventually overcome, the fortress of self-mastery grows stronger under pressure and cannot be taken by external force because its foundation lies beyond the reach of enemies. The architecture of internal discipline. The foundation of this fortress is internal discipline, not the harsh punitive self-control of the ascetic, but the purposeful organization of one's thoughts, emotions, and actions around clear principles and long-term objectives. The disciplined leader has made conscious choices about who he will be and how he will behave, then developed the habits and systems necessary to maintain these choices even under extreme pressure. This discipline manifests first in the leader's relationship with his own emotions and impulses. Rather than being driven by immediate feelings or reactions, he has developed the capacity to pause, assess situations objectively, and choose responses that serve his larger purposes. This does not mean suppressing emotions or becoming coldly calculating, but rather channeling emotional energy in service of rational objectives. The disciplined leader also maintains consistent daily practices that reinforce his chosen identity and values. These might include regular self-examination, systematic learning, physical training, or spiritual practices, whatever helps maintain the internal order necessary for effective external leadership. The specific practices matter less than their consistency and their connection to the leader's fundamental purposes. Perhaps most importantly, internal discipline creates a kind of personal sovereignty that cannot be threatened by external circumstances. The disciplined leader knows who he is independent of his position, wealth, or public approval, which means that threats to these external factors cannot shake his fundamental confidence or divert him from his chosen path. The cultivation of strategic patience. The second element of the fortress is strategic patience, the ability to maintain long-term perspective and resist the pressure for immediate results or reactions that often lead to poor decisions. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders distinguish themselves not by their ability to act quickly, but by their wisdom in knowing when to act and when to wait. Strategic patience requires several interconnected capabilities. First, the leader must be able to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort without rushing to premature action. Many leadership failures stem from decisions made primarily to relieve the psychological pressure of not knowing what to do rather than from genuine strategic necessity. Second, the patient leader must be able to see patterns and trends that others miss, understanding how current events fit into larger historical cycles and how present actions will influence future conditions. This long-term perspective allows him to make investments in areas that will pay dividends later, even when these investments require short-term sacrifice. Third, strategic patience enables the leader to wait for optimal timing rather than acting when conditions are merely adequate. The patient leader understands that the same action can have vastly different results depending on when it is taken, and he is willing to endure criticism for inaction in order to maximize the effectiveness of eventual action. This patience becomes a competitive advantage because most people, including most leaders, operate on much shorter time horizons. While others are reacting to immediate pressures and seeking quick fixes, the patient leader is positioning himself for long-term success and avoiding the mistakes that typically result from hasty action. The development of adaptive wisdom. The third component of the fortress is adaptive wisdom, the ability to learn continuously from experience, adjust strategies based on new information, and maintain effectiveness even as circumstances change dramatically. Unlike rigid adherence to fixed principles, adaptive wisdom represents a dynamic balance between consistency and flexibility. The wise leader maintains core principles that do not change but develops increasingly sophisticated understanding of how these principles can be applied in different situations and contexts. He recognizes that the same underlying value might require different actions under different circumstances, and he has developed the judgment necessary to make these distinctions effectively. Adaptive wisdom also involves the systematic cultivation of multiple perspectives on every significant issue. The wise leader actively seeks out viewpoints that challenge his assumptions, deliberately exposes himself to information that might contradict his preferences, and maintains relationships with people who will tell him uncomfortable truths. This creates a kind of internal diversity that makes him less vulnerable to blind spots and strategic mistakes. Furthermore, the adaptively wise leader has developed comfort with paradox and complexity, understanding that most important decisions involve trade-offs between competing goods rather than clear choices between right and wrong. This sophistication allows him to navigate complicated situations that would paralyze leaders who need simple, unambiguous solutions. The wisdom component of the fortress grows stronger with each challenge faced and each mistake made and learned from. Unlike other forms of strength that can be worn down by repeated use, adaptive wisdom actually increases through application, making the wise leader more formidable with age and experience. The network of authentic relationships. The fourth element of the unassailable fortress is the cultivation of authentic relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for others' well-being. While the popular conception of Machiavellian leadership emphasizes manipulation and self-interest, the historical Machiavelli understood that lasting power requires the voluntary support of others, which can only be earned through authentic relationship. The leader who has built a network of authentic relationships enjoys several forms of protection that cannot be purchased or commanded. First, his supporters are motivated by loyalty and affection rather than mere self-interest, making them more reliable during difficult times when supporting him might involve personal cost or risk. Second, authentic relationships create multiple channels of information and influence that enhance the leader's strategic capabilities. His network becomes an extension of his own intelligence gathering and decision-making capacity, providing early warning of problems and opportunities, as well as diverse perspectives on potential solutions. Third, the leader with authentic relationships has created what amounts to an immune system against the political diseases that typically destroy leaders. His supporters will defend him against unfair attacks, provide honest feedback about his weaknesses before they become fatal, and offer the emotional support necessary to maintain resilience during periods of intense pressure. Building these relationships requires genuine investment in others' success and well-being, not as a calculated strategy, but as an expression of the leader's fundamental values and character. The authentic relationships that form the strongest foundation cannot be faked or manufactured through manipulation. They must be earned through consistent demonstration of care, respect, and trustworthiness. The integration of purpose and power. The final and most crucial element of the fortress is the integration of personal purpose with the exercise of power, creating a form of leadership that serves something larger than the leader's own advancement while paradoxically making him more personally powerful than those who pursue power for its own sake. The purpose-driven leader has answered the fundamental question of why he seeks and exercises authority. His purpose provides not only motivation for the difficult work of leadership, but also a framework for making decisions and a standard for evaluating success. This clarity of purpose becomes a source of enormous strength because it eliminates the uncertainty and self-doubt that plague leaders who are motivated primarily by external validation or personal aggrandizement. Moreover, purpose-driven leadership naturally attracts followers who share the leader's values and objectives. These followers are more committed and effective than those who are motivated primarily by material rewards or personal loyalty, because they understand that their own purposes are served by the leader's success. The integration of purpose and power also creates a kind of moral authority that transcends formal position or legal authority. The leader whose power serves a larger purpose is perceived as legitimate even by those who disagree with his specific decisions, because they can see that he is motivated by something beyond self-interest. Perhaps most importantly, the purpose-driven leader has built-in protection against the corruption that typically accompanies power. Because his ultimate loyalty is to his purpose rather than to his position, he can make decisions and take actions that might threaten his immediate authority but serve his larger objectives. This paradoxically makes him stronger, because it demonstrates that his power is a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The practical application. From weakness to fortress, understanding the principles of the fortress is one thing. Building it in the face of real-world pressures and challenges is quite another. The transformation from vulnerable leadership to unshakable strength requires not only intellectual understanding, but systematic practice and gradual development of new habits and capabilities. The process begins with brutal self-assessment, examining one's current behavior against the 9 destructive patterns that Machiavelli identified. This requires the courage to see oneself clearly, without the protective filters of rationalization and self-deception that most people use to maintain their self-image. The leader must ask himself not whether he is perfect, but whether he exhibits any of the behaviors that consistently destroy leadership effectiveness. This self-examination cannot be a one-time event but must become a regular practice, built into the leader's routine like any other essential maintenance activity. Just as physical fitness requires consistent attention and cannot be achieved through sporadic effort, the fortress of self-mastery requires ongoing cultivation and reinforcement. The daily discipline of self-construction. The construction of the fortress begins with the establishment of daily practices that reinforce the leader's chosen identity and values. These practices serve multiple functions. They create consistency between the leader's professed principles and his actual behavior. They provide regular opportunities for self-correction when behavior strays from intentions, and they build the psychological strength necessary to maintain discipline under pressure. The specific practices will vary according to the individual leader's temperament, circumstances, and objectives, but they typically include some form of reflective self-examination, systematic learning or study, physical discipline, and service to others. The reflective component might involve journaling, meditation, prayer, or simply regular periods of quiet thought about one's actions and their alignment with one's principles. The learning component ensures that the leader continues growing in wisdom and capability rather than becoming complacent with his current level of knowledge and skill. This might involve reading, formal study, mentorship relationships, or deliberate exposure to new experiences and perspectives that challenge existing assumptions. Physical discipline creates a foundation of overall discipline that supports mental and emotional strength. The leader who cannot master his relationship with food, exercise, sleep, and other physical needs is unlikely to master the more complex challenges of leadership. Moreover, physical discipline provides a daily opportunity to practice the self-control that leadership requires in other domains. Service to others, whether through formal charitable work, informal mentorship, or simply acts of kindness and support, keeps the leader connected to his fundamental purpose and prevents the isolation that often accompanies positions of authority. Service also provides perspective on the leader's own problems and challenges, reminding him that leadership exists to serve others rather than to aggrandize oneself. The strategic elimination of vulnerability while building positive practices. The developing leader must simultaneously work to eliminate the specific behaviors that create vulnerability to external attack or internal collapse. This requires identifying which of the 9 destructive patterns pose the greatest risk in his particular situation and circumstances. For the leader struggling with consistency, this might mean developing systems for decision-making that ensure alignment with core principles even under pressure. This could involve creating written criteria for evaluating options, establishing advisory processes that include diverse perspectives, or simply building in delays that prevent impulsive reversals of previous positions. The emotionally reactive leader might focus on developing techniques for managing stress and maintaining composure during difficult situations. This could include breathing exercises, physical fitness routines that build stress tolerance, cognitive techniques for reframing challenging situations, or communication strategies that buy time for reflection before responding to provocative situations. The leader prone to isolation might establish formal systems for gathering information and feedback from diverse sources, schedule regular interaction with people at different levels of the organization or society, or create informal networks that provide unfiltered information about conditions and concerns. Each vulnerability requires a tailored approach based on its specific characteristics and the leader's particular circumstances. However, the general principle remains constant. Vulnerabilities must be systematically identified and eliminated rather than ignored or rationalized away. The expansion of capability and influence as the fortress takes shape through disciplined practice and the elimination of major vulnerabilities, the leader can begin expanding his capability and influence in ways that serve his larger purposes while strengthening his position. This expansion must be strategic rather than opportunistic, guided by the leader's fundamental objectives rather than immediate availability of power or position. The expansion of capability involves developing new skills, knowledge, and relationships that enhance the leader's effectiveness in pursuing his core purposes. This might mean learning new domains of expertise, building relationships with key stakeholders, developing better systems for managing complex operations, or simply becoming more skilled at communication and persuasion. The expansion of influence involves finding ways to have greater impact without necessarily seeking greater formal authority. The leader with a strong fortress often discovers that his influence extends far beyond his official position because people seek his counsel, follow his example, and support his initiatives voluntarily rather than out of compulsion. This expansion must be balanced with the maintenance of the fortress itself. The leader who becomes so focused on external goals that he neglects his internal discipline and development may find that his expanded capabilities and influence become liabilities rather than assets when he lacks the internal strength to manage them effectively. The test of crisis and challenge. The true test of the fortress comes during periods of intense crisis and challenge, when the leader faces pressures that would normally trigger the destructive behaviors that undermine leadership effectiveness. These situations reveal whether the fortress has been truly built or merely imagined, and they provide opportunities for further strengthening through successful navigation of genuine difficulty. The leader with a well-constructed fortress approaches crisis differently than his more vulnerable counterparts. Rather than becoming reactive or desperate, he maintains his strategic perspective and continues operating from his core principles even when immediate pressures suggest abandoning them would be advantageous. During crisis, the fortress leader also demonstrates the authentic relationships and purpose-driven motivation that form the foundation of his strength. His supporters rally to his cause not because they have been manipulated or bribed, but because they genuinely believe in his leadership and share his commitment to the larger purposes he serves. The crisis also tests the leader's adaptive wisdom, requiring him to apply his principles in new situations and find creative solutions to unprecedented problems. The leader whose fortress is genuine finds that crisis actually strengthens him by proving the effectiveness of his approach and deepening his confidence in his own capabilities. Most importantly, the leader who successfully navigates major crises while maintaining his integrity and effectiveness becomes genuinely unassailable in the way that Machiavelli envisioned. Having proven that external pressures cannot force him to abandon his principles or compromise his effectiveness, he achieves a form of independence that no external force can threaten. The paradox of invulnerability through service. The ultimate paradox of the fortress is that true invulnerability comes not from protecting oneself against others, but from dedicating oneself so completely to worthy purposes that personal survival becomes secondary to mission accomplishment. The leader who has achieved this state of consciousness cannot be threatened in any meaningful way because the worst his enemies can do, remove him from position or even threaten his life, cannot touch what he values most. This is not the same as reckless disregard for consequences or suicidal heroism. Rather, it represents the calm confidence that comes from knowing one's life has been invested in purposes that transcend personal mortality. The leader who has built his fortress around service to others finds that this service becomes its own reward and protection. Such leaders often discover that their apparent selflessness actually makes them more personally powerful than those who pursue power directly. Because their motivations are transparent and admirable, they attract followers who are genuinely committed to their success. Because their purposes align with widely shared values, they can build coalitions that transcend typical political divisions. Because their integrity is unquestioned, their words carry weight that no amount of formal authority can provide. The fortress leader also finds that his influence extends far beyond his lifetime, as the principles he embodied and the people he developed continue advancing his purposes long after he has departed the scene. In this way, he achieves a form of immortality that no external power can prevent and no enemy can destroy. This transformation from vulnerable leadership to fortress-like strength represents the culmination of Machiavellian wisdom, not the crude manipulation and expedient power-seeking that popular culture associates with his name, but the sophisticated understanding of how authentic strength develops and endures. The leader who masters himself in service of worthy purposes becomes, quite literally, unconquerable by external forces because the source of his power lies beyond their reach. In our modern era, when leadership faces unprecedented challenges and traditional sources of authority are questioned or rejected, these principles become even more relevant. The leader who understands how to build the fortress of self-mastery possesses advantages that no external circumstances can eliminate and tools that remain effective regardless of technological change or social transformation. The 9 behaviors that destroy leaders continue to claim victims in every generation, while the principles of the fortress continue to produce leaders whose influence extends far beyond their formal positions and whose strength grows rather than diminishes under pressure. The choice between these paths remains what it has always been: a decision about what kind of person one chooses to become and what purposes one chooses to serve. For those who choose wisely and act with discipline, the fortress awaits, impregnable, enduring, and eternally renewed through service to others. The legacy of such leadership extends far beyond the individual leader. to encompass all those whose lives are touched by his example and influence. In building his own fortress, the wise leader provides a model that others can follow, creating a multiplying effect that strengthens the entire fabric of society. This perhaps represents the highest achievement of leadership, not merely to succeed oneself, but to make it possible for others to succeed as well, building a legacy of strength that endures long after the builder has departed. Thus the circle completes itself, as Machiavelli always intended. The leader who destroys his weak self through disciplined service becomes not only undestroyable himself, but also a source of strength for all who come within his influence. In conquering himself, he conquers the world not through domination but through inspiration, leaving it stronger than he found it, and ensuring that his true victories can never be undone. In the end, the wisdom of Machiavelli reveals itself not as a manual for the acquisition of power, but as a guide for the transformation of character. The 9 behaviors that destroy leaders are merely symptoms of deeper weaknesses, while the fortress of self-mastery represents the cure not just for these symptoms, but for the underlying condition that produces them. The leader who undertakes this transformation discovers that in seeking to serve others, he has found the key to his own invincibility, not through the defeat of enemies, but through the elimination of the weaknesses that make enemies dangerous. This document stands not as the final word on leadership, but as an invitation to each reader to examine his own conduct against these timeless standards and to begin the daily work of constructing his own fortress. For in the end, no external teacher can build what must be constructed from within, and no external enemy can destroy what has been properly built. The choice, as always, remains our own.